until it's time.
Oh, there he is.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
How are we doing?
Hello, I'm
Hello.
back on my way home.
Okay. You get you going and going.
Good. Yeah, as it turned out.
Huh. Okay. Quite a coincidence there. As long as it's working.
Yeah, it's not happening. Yeah, well, and I need to. Anna was saying that it makes everybody car sick to watch me bounce up and down.
No, just me. I think I was the only one.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I hadn't had trouble.
I will.
I just won't look.
Aren't I just
So
one little?
ready.
I'll just put on speaker.
Louder. Is it good enough for you?
You can sit down. I'll be able to listen.
Yeah, but you're just gonna have to set it in such a way that you can see it.
Oh, there we
Hi,
go.
Nikki.
All right. So, how y'all doing?
Okay.
Any lingering issues from last week we should address? No. All right. Well.
Well, Richard, just a quick
Yeah.
thought. I wrote down a note of, I understand the science and the psychology that shows that we are social.
Mhm.
So in the future, are we going to find certain things, not an impediment, but like a disease of the brain? When people are antisocial.
Oh. Well, I mean, there definitely are diseases that make people antisocial in an extreme. But it's the bigger issue is just the variety of people that we're not all social to the same degree. And
Yeah, I can see that.
and our like I think actually DeWall's sort of idea about that moral pyramid, that the more you're kind of secure, the farther down this pyramid you're moving, and you can have a moral concern over much more than just sort of your own well-being.
Oh, right.
And how people experience life and then perceive that pyramid also is going to vary, even if objectively their conditions seem to be very similar. So it's just the complexity of so many different people. But anyway, so there's that.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that.
And curiously enough, what I'm doing here in the conclusion is a very optimistic kind of take in some ways on those kinds of questions. So that actually does sort of relate to the conclusion. And I thought I don't have a specific place where I talk about the answer to Janet's question last week. So I thought I would just start by answering that. And the way that I
Remind me what my question was.
Well, it's about navigating how to understand social interactions if people don't really have free will. And I hint at it, but the kind of fuller version of it is that I like to think of it as there is this myth that we all have free will in a if you just sort of let me use that language for a second. And we can live in that myth where we pretend it's true, or we can live outside of it. I've used this language from Wittgenstein a little bit with you all, where he calls these kinds of ideas language games. So it's sort of like there can be this language game that accepts free will. And I like calling it the myth of free will, to kind of sort of acknowledge along the way we're going to accept it, even though we know we should be suspicious. But it's because interpersonally we really have to. We can't. The experience of it is so profound that to try to live as if that's not true is really functionally impossible. And it would really be a disaster to try to do so in social interactions, because it's in our interactions with others that we kind of establish, we figure out what limits are, where boundaries are, we'll bounce off of other people. And so them responding positively or negatively to us is important in our figuring out how we're going to navigate the world. So interpersonally, we live inside the myth of free will. If we're going to have a conversation about public policy, if we especially are the people charged with doing public policy, and I think when we are acting like as voters, we're sort of in that role. So, but when we're doing something that is about how should society be organized, then I think we need to live outside the myth, acknowledge it really is an illusion, and then we figure out sociologically how to construct a society that's going to push and pull people in ways that kind of gets the best out of them. But it does, I think, have some immediate profound implications, like the idea that prisons are obviously just grossly immoral. If people aren't really free, then they can't be blamed in that kind of extreme way. Which doesn't mean there aren't some people who are dangerous and have to be controlled or isolated from society for some reason. So it may be necessary to protect society from people, but that does not justify the prison system that we have. So
it doesn't justify the cruelty that we
Exactly.
impose.
Yeah. So inside myth versus outside myth. But anyway, you look like you had a question, Janet.
Well, yeah, so now I'm remembering, I think my question was also related to the role of religion then, if we don't have free will. So just in the reading of your last chapter, though, it's in other reading, it seems like we might not have free will, but we still can take actions.
Yeah.
And that might be contrary to our immediate instinct. And that action could be finding something useful in a religious context.
Yeah.
That's kind of where I'm getting to, but I don't know if that means I'm living in the myth.
No, well, not necessarily. I mean, you can do it both ways. I think depending on the kind of question you're answering. But I think that what you're kind of pointing at is okay. So I have this phenomenological sense of myself. I'm going to stop and think about what should I do, and how do I think about that except as thinking of myself as an agent who is freely contemplating. It just happens that's not really what goes on. So.
Right, so we're back to in or out of the myth, but there's that hard and soft determinism. So,
which is kind of a variation on what I'm describing, except the soft determinist wants to live inside the myth all the time.
Okay, but it seems like there has to be degrees. I mean, you mentioned it degrees in terms of our safety level, but isn't there a sense that though we might not have free will, don't we still have some context of choice for anything?
Well, I think that's why, especially interpersonally, all of those rules of normal morality have to hold, is that you have to be able to sanction people when they're doing something that's wrong.
Yeah.
Hold them. So, but that's where learning comes in, and as I was mentioning, sort of last week, right? You don't have to have a free will to have learning. Learning is just a pattern response to the world. So you can take advantage of the fact that the human organism may not be freely making decisions, but it nonetheless will learn. And so that's
right. Okay.
So
yeah, I think that's and that fits. There was a Segundo quote that fit in with that, I think. About faith is a dynamic commitment to learning how to experience reality.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And of course, he especially wants us to learn from the past, that we're committed to. Yeah, the learning is the important emphasis in there. Okay, so that kind of gets me into kind of the main point of the chapter, which I think ironically, it's not exactly what you think of when you hear the word theology, but this chapter is theology. It's that's if you're going to look at what does academic theology look like in the world today, it's a little unusual in the way it's focused, but it's the topic and the way it addresses the topic, that's theology. And it has to do with I'm trying to describe reality in a way that suggests ways to relate to that reality. So the ought to, how should relate to reality, that's kind of turning the corner that makes it, in making it prescriptive, it's more akin to theology. And it's because, you know, working in a theoretical framework. Right? I mean, if working with scientific knowledge, those prescriptions can be a different kind of thing. But when I'm working with theoretical knowledge, those prescriptions take on this different kind of character, where the ought has any kind of power to it because one accepts the speculation that's leading to that idea, and the speculation should be informed and, you know, deeply rigorous. But it's still the fact that it's this kind of speculation makes it a kind of theology. Because I realize in reading it too, it's sort of it's like this big turn that I'm making, that doing all of this philosophy of mind and philosophy of religions and sociology stuff, and then all of a sudden, hey, let's do philosophy of history. So it's but the point is because it applies, it's the application and looking at implication of what all the other things that were coming before it. The other thing to keep in mind about how that kind of construction is working is that from this kind of sociological perspective, religion's job is really cultivating society. It's there to try and get people to think about, you know, talk about, wrestle with how ought we organize ourselves to live better. You know, that's really the ideal of what all religion is doing. Theology is sort of the intellectual, you know, kind of foreground of that. The theologian will trample into that territory first with big ideas. And the idea is to try to get the religion to follow along, thinking about those big ideas, and along the way, hopefully learn some important lessons and organize ourselves better and into the future. So what so the idea that I had, the conclusion that I came to after all of this other stuff was, I think if we see people the way I'm describing them, that helps us understand patterns in history. So that's the kind of theological turn I'm talking about. So I'm going to move from, I have this understanding that's coming from a lot of neuroscience, from psychology, from sociology, anthropology. And now I'm going to take that and look at this other topic and see what is it I can discern about that. And in that philosophy of history, then, sort of understanding how is it, because the idea is if we're going to make things better, it would help us to understand how things were in the past and how the present became the present and what kind of forces are pushing us in various directions into the future. So that philosophy of history has this important place in that kind of conversation about who we are and what we're doing and how we might do it better. But it has this curious kind of feel to it because I'm talking about it in a context in which I'm denying that humans have free will. And so what is it that's really going, what is it that I'm describing? And so what it comes to is that it's a complicated pattern And human beings are participants in this complicated pattern. And one goal of understanding would be to understand that this pattern called history. Or assuming we can discern some pattern, and it's not all just randomness, which of course is one approach to philosophy of history, is to just
I
say
have a
just
class.
random. Things just happen. Well, I'm convinced that's overly simplistic. And so what I start with is the most famous philosophy of history, which is the one that comes from Hegel. So that's why here I roll you right into Hegel kind of first right away, is that if I'm going to take on this question, I need to understand it, and understanding it means looking at who did this before me, and what did they have to say. Now, I guess so. Let's see. I did pick out some things I thought I should talk about along the way here. Yeah, I think the summary is probably not so important because we've just all been talking about it. So, oh, okay. I think it's worth explaining a little bit the bit on page 155. I'm bringing the idea of brain pearl, and then later on I explain where this comes from in the work of William James. And so James was, when he was doing his principles of psychology, one of the things he was thinking about was this question about free will. And since Descartes, this has been a kind of standard question in philosophy, because with Descartes gives us this vision that we call dualism, that there's a physical world, this world of stuff and matter, and then there is a kind of spiritual world. This is a world of God and souls and things like that. And then he wants to put mind into that idea-like, we call it idealist framework of souls and spirits. And so if you ask, well, how is the human, this human creature coming to make decisions? And his answer is, well, it has something to do with that soul. And so the spirit in the machine, which was Gilbert Ryle's way of making fun of this idea, that spirit in the machine is somehow controlling the machine. Now, the problem with this idea has always been, well, if these are two different kinds of substances, how in the world does one of them control the other? That just makes no sense, because all of our models for how material is controlled are all material methods of control. How would non-material stuff control? So that problem has vexed Descartes from the beginning. Okay, so that's Descartes. What is that? Late 1500s. Get up to late 1800s, early 1900s with William James, and people have still been pondering this, but we've been moving towards this more materialist way of thinking all along the way, developing more science and whatnot. So James is thinking about this from his psychological vantage point, and what he comes to is that, okay, what Descartes said would make sense, and we could see some evidence of it if we could identify some cluster within the brain, because he's beginning to know a little bit about neurology. If we could identify some cluster in the brain that was independent somehow, and therefore was in control, because the material sense of it, the scientific insight, once you recognize brains are just neurons are just material stuff, well, then mind is just what brain does. Mind is not stuff. Mind's just an activity of brains. So there can't be anyone in control, which is kind of one of the things Dennett, I quoted him about that too along the way. But James's idea was, well, if we could find this cluster, and he called it a brain pearl. In another place, he calls it a pontifical neuron. We imagine there is a neuron that's in charge of everything else pontifical, but in the end, what he comes to is, well, yeah, it would work if we found those things, but there's no reason to think those things exist. And of course, in the 100-year sense, we haven't found them. So anyway, so that's the brain pearl idea. Let's see here. Let's see. All right. So when we get to, all right, so I do along the way talk, talk a little bit about the science and collaborative relationships and stuff like that, sort of laying out some things that are sort of important about what it is to be human. Because I think that's the point that I want to start with, right? Is this construct of what is this human self, and now this human self is engaged in other selves in history. So one of the important things to note, we've learned along the way, right, is the social piece. So that we're deeply social, and what I was hinting along the way, but I'm going to kind of call out more in the conclusion, is that mutually supportive, more egalitarian relationships seem to be healthier. So we do better when we have that kind of relationship with the world, which is to say rigid hierarchies are not psychologically healthy. So, okay, well, that's interesting. That seems important to note. And along the way, then I argue there are reasons why we might see that history does actually make some progress, that it's not just, I forgot it's a great famous line, history is just one damn thing after another. Anyway, I'll have to look that up. Can't remember who said that, but the idea is it's an argument with Hegel that because Hegel was insisting, no, there's a pattern, and we are in fact moving towards something. Now, I don't think, for deeper philosophical reasons, I don't think that towards something, that being pulled towards something makes any sense. But there is a way of thinking about us getting pushed somewhere. So, and I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier. There's this idea from biology that is called teleonomy. Well, so teleology from the Greek telos, end. So teleology is the idea that something is end directed, and is developed most especially by Aristotle, who had thought this was a deep part of how the basic structure of reality works, is that everything's being pulled towards a kind of its ideal version of itself. That the acorn wants to be an oak tree, and so that oak tree, in a sense, is pulling the acorn towards being an oak. So philosophically, that doesn't kind of make sense in a materialist world. But the biologists have noticed, well, there are these patterns that come up in biology, like thumbs, where if you look at their development over time, it looks like that was where biology wanted to go, that's the goal, that evolution wanted us to have thumbs. But that's not how evolution works. Evolution is just random, and it keeps what works. And it just happens over time that thumbs are very useful. So we get the appearance of evolution was being pulled towards a particular goal. But that's not really true. It just looks that way. And so that's then picked out by the word teleonomy. So there is something pushing the development, which is sort of the randomness of gene mutation and then successful reproduction, natural selection. So there is this thing pushing, which just wants more efficiency, really. And it finds thumbs, latches onto them, bingo, you get thumbs. So teleonomy. Hegel's view is very much a teleology, that something is pulling history along. So first thing, we should do a little bit with Hegel, which is always a little painful, but we'll try and do just a little of it. So first off, come on. No. Get the Chrome up. All right. So Hegel, in talking, Hegel is difficult, which is one thing everyone will agree. But he has these important ideas along the way. And one of them is about reality moving, which is an important part of his philosophy of history, because he starts with the idea that reality itself is a process. And he describes that process with the word dialectics. And I'm going to talk more about that next week, because I'm going to do something kind of even more speculative next week with you all. But it's important to introduce it a little bit to understand how his philosophy of history is working. So I have here a little introduction to this idea about dialectics. But it's someone trying to cram it all into a 3-minute video. So he's going to talk a little fast. So try and pay attention, and then we'll talk about it later.
So there was this German guy named George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. But since we're good friends, let's just call him Hegel. Hegel was one of those philosopher guys, as in he thinks and talks a lot to the annoyance of his friends and families. But then one day he got this great idea and decided to write it down. The idea was dialectical arguments. So what is dialectical arguments? Asked Hegel. Before we can answer that, let's talk about truth. There's a lot of debate around the truth, whether we can find it, whether it exists at all. But one thing that all the big brains philosophers agreed on is that the truth is really complicated and really hard to grasp with. Hence, the truth is represented by this lock. And like all locks, it needed a key to be opened. And like all naughty philosophers, Hegel wanted to open the truth. So through years of hard work and education, Hegel found the key for the lock. And he called it dialectical arguments. Hegel then used dialectical arguments to unlock the truth. Good for him. So where do we begin our search for dialectical arguments? Well, like all good devices, it begins with an argument. In this case, a thesis is formed. It's important to point out that Hegel didn't actually use these terminologies in his writings. The concept of thesis and antithesis was coined by Kant, who was a villain from the hit sci-fi series Star Trek. A thesis could be anything from, I think pineapple on pizza tastes good, to something like, water is a liquid. Now that we have a thesis, the next part of the puzzle is the antithesis, a contradiction. Now be aware that an antithesis need not be a direct opposite of the thesis. In most cases, it should be a counter-argument that put the thesis into question. I like to call it the actually statement. In my experience, the actually is best visualized to be spoken by an annoying character. So for this example, let's imagine Hegel saying something along the line of, actually, when water is boiled at 100 degrees Celsius, it transitions from a liquid state to a gas state. I know, right? So what now? You have two statements that by their own only tell a small portion of the truth. But when worked together, the thesis and the antithesis create something entirely new. Hegel calls this the synthesis. And the synthesis is as close as you can get to the truth, given the information you have available. So by combining these two arguments, you realize that water can either be a liquid or a gas, depending on the temperature. But what about ice, the solid state of water? Well, this goes into Hegel's constant state of motion that all things go through in his writing. This means that you can always question what you've learned by creating a new argument against it, from which you can synthesize a better, fuller truth. First, finding truth is a process that requires the acknowledgement of two contradicting arguments. Second, finding truth is a process of synthesizing two contradicting arguments. And third, finding truth is a constant process of finding new information to put into question what you have previously learned.
Okay.
The way.
Oh, stop that. So, basic overview of this dialectical logic is the way Hegel would phrase that. Now, he's using this because he's convinced this is a pattern you find in history, that there is these contradictions. Something happens, it evokes a contradiction. Those things have some sort of conflict that comes to a resolution of synthesis, but that synthesis then will provoke a new antithesis, becomes its own thesis, provokes a new contradiction. So history is moving through this bouncing of things bumping up against each other, finding opposites. So let's see, what did I want to do next? Probably worth just this longer version of how he applies this to history. Okay, so let's do that, and then I'll get into something a little more concrete with it. So it's a little bit longer and a little bit more abstract.
By far the most influential philosopher of history in the early 19th century, and maybe ever, was Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel completely agreed with the Romantic idea that nobody can escape from his own time to take a position outside of history. The way we think, the way we are, is shaped by our history and our culture. And if that holds for individuals, Hegel says, it also holds for philosophy and for science. We can only think in a way that fits our current time. At the next stage of history, people will think differently. So we cannot and we should not hope that philosophical or scientific theories we come up with today will remain acceptable for all eternity. As history progresses, any thought will be discarded and replaced by something new. We cannot reach any eternal truths. The best thing we can do is to try and think through the thoughts of today as well as possible. As Hegel put it, philosophy is its own time captured in thought. Since we are all part of history and cannot escape from our historical position, then if you want to understand yourself or your own ways of thinking, you have to study history. But Hegel thinks, studying history is only going to generate understanding if there is some kind of pattern in history, if things don't just happen at random. If they did just happen at random, what could we learn from it? We need a pattern. And Hegel believes that such a pattern exists, that if we study history, we can find something like a law of historical development. What Hegel wants to do then is to describe and clarify that law. Now this may sound quite a lot like what we heard about Hempel and his deductive nomological model in one of our previous lectures. But Hegel's idea is very different from Hempel's. Hempel believed that historians use the same kind of laws that physicists use, or that anyone in any scientific discipline uses. Laws that link causes with effects. Laws that tell us that every time A happens, B will happen afterwards. And we have seen that it is really hard to find such laws in history. But Hegel is thinking of something else entirely. Unlike Hempel, Hegel is not interested in events that happen again and again. He is aware that history never repeats itself, that every stage of history is new and unique. What he wants to understand is why these unique stages follow each other in the way that they did. And his idea is that these stages develop out of each other through the logical development of society's underlying concepts. Now that sounds pretty abstract. So before I'm going to say anything more about it, I want to give an example from the history of politics. If you look at how the political structures of society have developed over the millennia, Hegel tells us, you can see the following pattern. First, there is a stage of lawlessness, where there is no state and everybody can basically do what they want, provided they are strong enough or smart enough or have enough friends to get away with it. Second, there was a very long stage of autocratic rule, states with one or a few persons at the top and a strict hierarchy that structures the rest of society. And third, Hegel says, is the stage that he and we find ourselves in, the stage of what in German and Dutch is called the Rechtsstaat. That is a state in which everyone's powers are strictly limited by the law, and in which, if it's a democracy at least, everyone has a say in what those laws are. Now, according to Hegel, this succession, lawlessness, strict hierarchies, rechtsstaat, is not accidental. In fact, in it we can see the logical development of the concept of freedom. It works like this. What is freedom? Our first answer might be the ability to do whatever you want. If I can do whatever I want, then I'm free, right? And Hegel points out that this is exactly the idea of freedom that is embodied in the stage of lawlessness. If there is no government, then everybody can just do what they want. But Hegel goes on to say, this ability to do whatever you want is not really freedom. It looks like freedom, but in fact it contains a form of unfreedom. Consider this. Maybe I have decided that I hate going hungry in winter. And in order to make sure that I won't, I spend the entire spring, summer, and autumn working as a farmer. It's hard work, but by the end of autumn, my house is full of grain. I can do all of that because there is no law forbidding it. So I may seem quite free. But now winter starts, and suddenly a group of big guys and gals shows up on my doorstep carrying huge clubs. Give us all your food, they say. And I'm like, no way, I worked for that the entire year while you guys were just lying on the beach. And they're like, yeah, that sucks, but we've got clubs. So in the end, what can I do but give them all my food? And next year, I'm not going to farm again. I'm going to lie on the beach as well. What this story suggests is that lawlessness isn't really freedom. I'm not really free to be a farmer in a society where anyone else is free to then take away the fruits of my labor. Lawlessness may look like freedom, but it contains a kind of contradiction. It is also unfreedom. Now, according to Hegel, such contradictions are the engines of history. They are what push history forward. A society based on a contradiction isn't stable. A new stage of history will follow in which society, often unconsciously, tries to solve that contradiction. And the first new stage will be one which is the opposite of the original contradiction. So instead of lawlessness, the next stage in history is going to be a society of strict laws. Because that might also seem to be a kind of freedom. If there are strict laws, then nobody can take away the fruits of my labor. I know what I can and what I can't do, and I can live my life accordingly. The existence of strict laws makes it possible for me to be a farmer, to have property, to live without the fear of violence. If anyone comes to steal my food, the ruler will send his police force and punish them. So it may seem as if I am free. But of course, strict hierarchies don't just lead to freedom. They also lead to unfreedom. In this kind of society, I have to obey the ruler. If he wants me to pay 10% of my grain to him, I have to do so. If he wants me to build a palace for him, I have to do so as well. And so on. So again, we have a kind of contradiction. The strict lawgiver seems to give me freedom, but he also takes away my freedom. Again, we have an unstable situation, and history will have to take another step. This third step, Hegel tells us, is going to be a synthesis of the earlier two opposites, which are called the thesis and the antithesis. In the synthesis, the contradiction between the thesis and the antithesis is resolved. The synthesis will contain the good elements of both the thesis and the antithesis while overcoming their weaknesses. In our example, the good element of the thesis was the fact that I had control over my own destiny. The good element of the antithesis was that I was protected by the law. In our current society, Hegel points out, both elements are present. We are protected by laws that allow us to control our own destiny, and in a democracy, we have some control over the laws themselves. Thus, the contradiction which was present in the earlier stages of history has been overcome. Let us return to what I said about Hegel's historical law. I said that Hegel believes that the unique stages of history develop out of each other through the logical development of society's underlying concepts. We can now see what he means. Our political history shows the development of the underlying concept of freedom. From our current point of view, we can understand why it was logical that society went through these three stages and in this order. And if we look at any other major change in history, Hegel tells us, we can see the same thing. The structure of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis is everywhere. Before we end this lecture, I want to make a few quick points. First, Hegel believes that history is a story of progress. The synthesis is better than the thesis and the antithesis, since it contains the good elements of both. So as history goes on, the underlying concepts of our societies become more and more rational. But second, Hegel does not believe, at least according to most Hegel scholars, that we will ever arrive at that perfection. A synthesis is not the final word. It's going to turn out to have its own contradictions and will be the thesis in a new development. So we have thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and then the synthesis itself will be followed by a new antithesis and a new synthesis, and so on. History isn't stopping. And third, Hegel does not believe that knowing about the logic of history will allow you to predict the future. You can only recognize the problems with the underlying ideas of a society and the logical development that will lead to the next stage once that next stage has been achieved. We can look back at the old hierarchical societies and see what was wrong with them, but the people back then couldn't do that. Historical understanding is always retrospective, which brings us back to the main idea of the Romantics. Nobody can escape from their own historical situation.
Okay. So there's actually, Hegel had a very famous line where he says, the owl of Minerva only takes flight at dusk. And the owl of Minerva is a character from ancient history, from the I think Romans, symbol of wisdom. And the idea only takes flight at night. So the wisdom only happens after the end of the day. So you only learn because you can look backwards at history and see what it was. Going forward, much harder. So what I'm doing here is agreeing with Hegel that there is an important pattern, that dialectics as a matter of logic is useful for understanding that pattern. But where I'm disagreeing with him is him saying that it is the idea of freedom that's working itself out. So what is the engine in this history? So there's the pattern, and then there's the driver, the engine of it, what's making it go. And that's actually what this chapter is about, is me offering a theory about what that engine is. And this is important because even with Marxism, what Marx does is take Hegel's philosophy of history, and he says, okay, well, this idealist thing about ideas driving it, idea freedom, that's obviously wrong. It's not that. Hegel's just got it upside down. It is the material conditions of life that are driving the process. But saying that in and of itself doesn't identify the actual engine. He's just identifying the context. It's a material context, not an ideal context for Marx. But Marxist philosophy has always left open that question. What really is driving people to do things that actually changes history? And this is where I think the philosophy I've been developing comes in. And the important bit in all of that is people are healthiest in mutual relationships, more egalitarian relationships, mutually recognizable, mutually recognizing each other. Remember that idea from Camus, we all need to be recognized. There's another important version of that that I get from Erich Fromm, who is mid-20th century German philosopher and psychoanalyst. So I have just a little bit, this is actually from him, from an interview with him, where he's talking about the importance of this, of equality, and how, and also how it helps us with happiness.
Equality, one once understood equality in the very same sense in which the Bible speaks of equality, that we are all equal in as much as we are created in the image of God. Or if I don't use theological language, that we are all equal in the sense that no man must be the means for the purposes of another man, but each individual is an end in himself. Today, we talk a lot about equality, but I think what most people mean by it is sameness, that everybody is the same, and they are afraid if they are not the same, they are not equal.
So it's not that.
Well, happiness is a very proud word of our whole cultural heritage. I think if you ask what people really mean by happiness today, it is the experience of unlimited consumption, the kind of thing Mr. Huxley has described in The Brave New World. I think if you would ask people what their concept of heaven is, and if they were honest, they would say it's a kind of big department store with new things every week and enough money to buy everything new. Happiness today, I think, is for most people the satisfaction of the eternal suckling to drink in more, this, that, and the other. Happiness should be something which results from the creative, genuine, intense relatedness, awareness, responsiveness to everything in life, to man, to nature. Happiness does not exclude sadness. If a person responds to life, he's sometimes happy and sometimes sad. What matters is he responds.
Sleep Number Smart Sleepers get 28 minutes more restful sleep per night. Visit sleepnumber.com to shop now.
Okay, maybe
Ray,
that was
I'm
it.
only
Yeah, so it's just that short little bit. But point is, this is actually, it's deep in a lot of Fromm's work, that it's a drive for this mutual recognition that's driving human psychology. Now, Hegel himself recognizes this to some degree, and in fact there is a place in which he describes a really important observation about about why revolution's happening, and that there are that one thing that is important about history changing is the underdog challenging things. And this is going to be very important to how I want to understand this story. And he calls it the master-slave dialectic. And I found a really, really fun, short introduction to this concept.
Do my project on the master-slave dialectic. German philosopher George Hegel believed that a person must receive acknowledgement of their consciousness from another person in order for their consciousness to actually exist. Due to this need for acknowledgement, when two people, both being self-conscious beings, meet, they are both focused.
I guess here, let me point out, so Hegel's putting this forward as sort of a matter of how psychology works, that it's where we want to have this recognition. Fromm's coming along as the psychologist saying, and we can measure bad consequences that follow when we don't have it, and we have to try and treat them with psychological tools. So the psychologist is saying this is really, really deep in the human psyche, this need for recognition.
on receiving that much desired acknowledgement. This is all well and good, except for the fact that neither of these people are willing to give that acknowledgement to the other. What to do? What to do? The obvious answer? Kill the other person. However, this becomes problematic because if person 1 kills person 2, then neither of the two receive what they so desire. Also, one would be dead, and that kind of ruins things. With killing ruled out, these two people must come up with an alternative solution. What is the solution, you ask? The master-slave relationship, of course. One person, probably the one that doesn't want to die, voluntarily becomes a subordinate to the other person. This process, I imagine, is complicated and messy, but somehow must be done for this relationship to work. The person who becomes a subordinate is the slave in the relationship, believing that their master, or the superior, has complete power over them. The slave must believe that he or she has no power over their master. The master then has to make sure that the slave never discovers the power they actually hold over them. For when the slave discovers their power, the master-slave relationship no longer exists. Once the slave realizes his or her own consciousness, the slave becomes free in their head. Now the slave must gain freedom outside of their head. How is this done? Usually by some kind of rebellion that changes who things are. However, even without a rebellion, if a slave realizes their master's reliance on them, they break the master-slave relationship for themselves. I am sure you all have seen or at least heard of the Pixar film A Bug's Life. While this movie seems to the average Joe a cute little la-di-da bugs are awesome movie, we as students of theory, criticism, and aesthetics know that there is always something more. The master-slave dialectic exists in this film. The grasshoppers, more specifically Hopper, creates his role as the master over the ants by instilling in their minds that they have no power and rely on him and the rest of the grasshoppers for survival. Here, Hopper tells the ants how nature works.
Buggy bug world out there, princess. One of those circle of life kind of things. Now let me tell you how things are supposed to be. The sun grows the food, the ants pick the food, the grasshoppers eat the food.
Further forcing the slave position on the ants and making them choose the subordinate role. Hopper makes the ants believe that they need the grasshoppers because they, as inferior ants, cannot possibly protect themselves against more dangerous or bigger bugs.
If you don't keep your end of the bargain, then I can't guarantee your safety, and there are insects out there that will take advantage of you. Someone.
Hopper is well aware of the danger that comes with the ants realizing their power and rebelling, so he uses intimidation to keep them down. Flick is the first of the ants to realize his power. He challenges the need to work for Hopper and do his bidding. For Flick, the master-slave relationship starts to fall apart. When he sets off to find reinforcements to fight the grasshoppers instead of serve them, the rest of the ants think he has completely lost his mind and continue to pick food for the grasshoppers. As he leaves, Flick exclaims, making it clear that he is ready for a rebellion. The movie then switches focus to the grasshoppers. Another grasshopper brings the idea of not needing to go back to the ants' island for food up to Hopper. He explains to him that they have plenty of food where they are. Hopper comes back by saying,
You let one ant stand up to us, then they all might stand up. Those puny little ants outnumber us 100 to 1. And if they ever figure that out, there goes our way of life. It's not about food. It's about keeping those ants in line. That's why we're going back.
Hopper has clearly stated that the ants actually have a lot of power over the grasshoppers, and that if the ants were to find this out, the grasshoppers would lose their current way of life, and the master-slave relationship would be destroyed. In a desperate attempt to save the master-slave relationship, Hopper says,
No, I'm wrong. You're lower than dirt. You're an ant. Let this be a lesson to all you ants. Ideas are very dangerous things. You are mindless, soil-shoving losers. Put on this earth to serve us.
When Hopper says ideas, he is referring to the idea that as ants, they have power and can rebel against the grasshoppers. He knows that the ants have started to realize their own consciousness.
I've seen these ants do great things. And year after year, they somehow manage to pick food for themselves and you. So who is the weaker species? Don't serve grasshoppers. It's you who need us. We're a lot stronger than you say we are. And you know it, don't you?
And with this, the ants band together and destroy the master-slave relationship that they were once stuck in between themselves and the grasshoppers. Yay!
See, Hopper, nature has a certain order. The ants pick the food, the ants take the food, and the grasshoppers take it.
Yeah. Okay. Nope. Stop
I'm
that.
in.
Okay. What did I do? What did I do? There we go. Okay. That. Okay. So still from Hegel, you get the sense that it's there's a hard point, right? With the master-slave dialectics running up against things. And it sort of implies that people are kind of naturally going to reject this sort of arrangement. But it's clear from history that people will tolerate a lot. And so they do seem to tolerate these kinds of arrangements for long periods of time. So it seems like you need something a little bigger to answer the question, what's going to drive change? What would motivate people to not just recognize the master-slave dialectic and the logic that's implied there, that the slaves actually have power, but what's going to motivate them to really move, to act on that? And I submit that it's about us, that there is something about human beings that will do this. And in fact, Frans de Waal has taught us that it's not just humans, it's in fact primates, and a lot of mammals, but there is something he's shown us that it's very deep in primates that's going to resist. And the last video I have here, I think is one of the most important important experiments ever in the history of science.
So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs and with birds and with chimpanzees, but with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, it's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece he eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. He tests the rock now against the wall. He needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically
Okay, you get the idea. All right, let's see here. So it turns out a little capuchin monkey knows when it's being dissed. It's that simple. So my argument is that it is just in our nature that just as these other things I've described, that we need existential definition, we need social cohesion, we need recognition. But one of the consequences of that needing recognition is that we recognize when we're being recognized, when we're being treated unequally. And because we have a sense, a basic human sense that we're all human, as the capuchin monkey has a basic sense that we're all capuchins. Why are you getting a grape? I'm getting this water thing. So my point is that you add all that together, and that I think explains this pattern we see in history towards more mutually egalitarian and what's the phrase? There was a better phrase I had, mutual recognition. Anyway, a pattern towards greater and greater levels of mutual recognition in society, because that we have the natural drive that will resist, and it will act out when it's provoked, and that's why you can't ever keep people down forever. They will eventually revolt. Something will happen and they'll eventually revolt. So that's the big idea in the conclusion. Now, as a theological project, it's an interim step, in that there is a next question to ask, which is, well, what do we do with this information? And what I think is called for is that this needs to be woven into the way that theology works itself out and thinks about what it is to be human, and how we're going to live with ourselves, and then how we go about organizing ourselves to have more and more equality, because that's who we are. What do you think?
I agree. I mean, I saw it when I taught, primary children had a very strong sense of fairness. Very strong sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but with when there's a difference in power, it's not so easy to act out against the person who's getting the larger portion.
And conversely, when we think of healthier relationships as being more equal, we have seen over and over again what happens when there is a hierarchy of power in institutions, right? In the church and in corporations and in other situations where it's a very defined hierarchy, we've seen a lot of abuses. Unhealthy relationships.
Janet?
Well, I guess two questions. I mean, I'm not sure that hierarchy is the same as a master-slave relationship. Maybe I need to think about that some more. But I guess the second question is, have you moved away now from the religion question, or are we supposed to be wondering if religion is a way to answer that drive?
Well, so yeah, that then becomes the implication, right? That, well, in fact, religion has played both sides of this role, right? Religion is used by the powerful to justify their position, but religion can also be used by the oppressed to resist their oppression, which is the whole idea behind liberation theology.
Right, but it's still not going to be without hierarchy. I don't know.
Well, hierarchy in of itself may be sort of may have some naturalness to it, in that, like, adults are always going to know more than children do, and you need to teach the children, and there is a kind of natural hierarchy that comes with being an adult and being a child. But it's more what's more the issue are the structures of that society reinforcing, like, really big inequalities? Because the more of that inequality, the less healthy the society is going to get, the more that dysfunction is going to need violent reinforcement. So you get the institutional version of master slave in the structure of society. But you can imagine, less rigid hierarchies that you could organize people with, in which you don't get the reinforcement of gross inequalities, but you just get a sense of order out of it or something.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think equality is a big piece of it. Which is why I bring in the Capuchins. That we are. I think we do really have this drive, and I think the argument I'm making is it does explain history. That this is the reason we see what we see in history, is because human beings are doing this. We're constantly renegotiating the territory of these hierarchies, and it does seem like it's started, with Stone Age peoples who had fairly egalitarian relationships, and then you can talk about how history becomes the rigid hierarchy that Hegel was talking about, and then that starts to break down with democratic revolutions, and we sort of move towards ideals of more and more equality, starting with the idea of political equality. Now we're noticing that the political equality does not produce economic equality, and so that has other problems. So it's not, history has to keep moving.
And if I understood a certain section of what you wrote, that so these natural tendencies can be overridden by our survival instincts, and so I can more readily see now that people can exploit fear to sort of override the fairness and equality instinct.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Yeah. So it's, I mean, like, I think, it's sort of following the other features I'm talking about, that part of what religion here, I'd say, should be doing is navigating the fragility in the system. The system's fragile because people can be manipulated into accepting these hierarchies because they're like the grasshoppers, threatening them. So people can accept that. I mean, that's sort of the whole phenomenon with fascist politics and the rise of Trump, is people may recognize that they're buying into a hierarchy, but they think somehow that hierarchy will protect them. And if they're feeling fragile enough, they'll accept a lot of domination in the hierarchy for the sake of that safety. Even if all of it is sort of an illusion that they're buying into, if they buy the illusion, that's a powerful force.
That's very descriptive of the Third Reich and
Yeah.
what happened there. And it kind of self-destructed. It could have gone on for a long time if they hadn't starting wars over in Europe. But it was a very solid, strong structure, and that disassembled itself over power.
And very much is there claiming to protect people.
Right, right. People that I think that's why they accepted it. They could accept all the harshness of it was that it was kind of dependable in a certain way, and it was a kind of a feeling of protection and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they were really suffering, weren't they, after World War One? Wasn't Germany really suffering?
Yeah,
I mean, we really penalized them.
Yeah, much. Yeah, and people now think it was that. Yeah, it was just unreasonable war reparations demands and things like that that plunged the German economy into depression, and that and people, we're seeing it around us today, right? I mean, some friends and we were just talking about earlier this morning, and if you take like what the Republicans are doing is they've substituted Jews for trans people. So, all of your problems are about why that's a problem, but it doesn't have to be rational. It just sort of, if you point at something often enough and say, that's the source of your problem, and then you organize people around fighting that thing that you're pointed at, then you get enough of them to fall for it. There you have a fascist movement. And it's a scary phenomenon. And it's because people are feeling fragile, and a lot of working people, their wages haven't been going anywhere for 4 decades, and lifestyles have collapsed, and people feel very vulnerable. And then that can be the easy sort of story to tell. That's your problem, rather than pointing at the system, that the economic system needs to be adjusted and to be more fair. No, it's those immigrants, or it's those gay people, or it's those trans people, that's your problem, or it's the Jews, in the case of the Nazis. But it's the same formula. Which again, so this is sort of part of the reason why these kinds of ideas are important, is that to understand this history means we can also try to intervene when we see it repeating itself. Actually, there's an interesting line. Marx has a line it's in a book he calls The 18th Brumaire, where he's talking about Napoleon's nephew, who had become the new emperor, the new Napoleon. And he says, Hegel remarks somewhere that history repeats itself twice. He forgot to add the first time as tragedy and the second as farce. And it's sort of, when you think about, when I look at like DeSantis, it's sort of like Hitler is the tragedy and DeSantis is the farce. It's the same politics repeating itself. Yeah, Bill.
Yeah.
Nope, not working.
I
think you're frozen a little bit.
So
we're not hearing you.
Uh-oh. That's always frustrating. Okay. Hopefully his computer will find its way to a connection or something. Trying again. Okay. Yeah. All right. That
my father-in-law was. I don't. If you can't hear, let's not say anything. But,
we can hear you now.
Yeah, it seems to me, and it probably has to do. You can or can't.
You can. Go ahead.
You can.
We can hear you.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. It seems that you can. Yes. It seems to me that in your, if you go to sleep at night, you settle into whatever is in your brain and what is your norm, and you don't necessarily have to abide by whatever the society thinks you should do, and that's something that for me is a comfort, because I realize I can go on my own and do things. And my father-in-law was a Austrian who was a very good, well-informed socialist in the middle of the 1930s in Austria. But when he came to the United States, he became a very good capitalist. He basically changed absolutely, and he didn't have to live underneath this socialist view of things, which is, the Nazis is not necessarily the same, but it's still him changing and adapting, and he took the responsibility for that, and benefit from the consequences. And I think that that's something we all have as a reserve. And in the Hegel, the concept of domination, you can't get me into that room very far before I rebel against it in a way. And I think a lot of people feel the same. So there's some comfort level about being on your own. You can be an inventor, you can do a whole lot of other things and make your way through the world without being influenced by other people. Thomas Edison,
as long as the context is allowing it.
Yeah,
right? Yeah,
exactly.
you can't have the grasshoppers taking everything you make.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that the context, exactly. I mean, that's only if you as an individual are allowed to be that individual. And that, as we know, has a lot to do with, your skin color or any obvious signs on your body that maybe you're not in line, because it's not going to work otherwise, I think.
Well, and I think I've heard this kind of story actually from about Europeans immigrating around the war, either before, during, or after, but that some of them start out very radical in their politics, and they get to the United States and they discover their context is so different that their politics changes. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is the feudal system that Europe had. That a lot of Europe is still very aware of those old class divisions in the feudal system, and British people will talk about that. They're much more conscious of class issues and than the Americans are. So I think a lot of European radicals, when they got here in that time period, especially the 40s, they just discovered America was just so very different than Europe, because we didn't have those kinds of built-in class divisions. And so they discovered that they were suddenly much more free. Even as a worker, they could be free enough to create something new and become businessman, where in Europe that was just totally impossible because the class system was so much more rigid. And so that rigid class system drove them to a much more radical politics as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's common story. Okay, let's see, is there anything at the end here I wanted to, before I let go? Oh, I do. Yeah, we did talk about it. It doesn't always work out. So I do talk about this as a pattern, that we have a tendency to react to injustice, which doesn't mean we always will, or it doesn't mean we'll always be successful, but that it's a tendency. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that that's how all of these things should be understood. They're not iron laws. They're just a tendency that produces a pattern that we can identify, but it doesn't always hold, because the tendency doesn't always hold.
And Richard, in terms of the operating system and the emotional, existential, and social dynamics that religion brings, I mean, I'm seeing that science is doing sort of the same thing. Science is telling us what's emotionally healthy for us, and it's telling us how we should live more productively and happier, and it's telling us how productive interpersonal relationships can be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So-
so it's a matter of religion being a social structure to try to maximize all of that then. And so that's so as a matter of what religion can be, and I would say it ought to be, then that's it, is that it's about cultivating our humanity, and we should do so with the best information possible.
Oh, I see. So it would be religion that takes this information and helps this, make it better, supposedly, make the
Yeah.
world better. Oh, that makes a little more sense because I was really resisting when you say religions are not irrational. But
We're not
that
always.
what they're not always. Well, in your world, I shouldn't say your world, but in your theory, I can see that connection. That makes me feel a little better, that religion should take the science and then talk to its people, so to speak.
Yeah, I think, well, like when I was introducing you to Secundo, he has this, he's very much attached to the idea that there is this wisdom that's being buried in scripture, but also in great art. And he doesn't talk about science, especially the natural sciences, in quite the same way. But I would argue that it's a matter of doing the same thing that he's talking about, that we need to recognize where wisdom about the world's coming from in lots of different ways. Segundo talks about that in some places when he talks about society, because he's a Marxist, so he wants to use what Marx will call that science of historical materialism. He wants to make use of that, and is very much into the idea that as a priest, as a theologian, his role is to teach people about these ideas. But wherever this great wisdom can be found, needs to be engaged. And that's why he talks about faith. For him, is an openness to learning, right? That's what faith for him, faith really means, is that you accept that the world is there, and you can learn about it and act in it. Is sort of the corollary of that you can act in it. Yeah, okay, so what next week, I'm not quite sure how next week will go. We'll just have to try. That last piece is kind of deeper philosophical speculation, and what I'm trying to do, and I'm over time I have moved away from this thinking, but at the time, the idea I was really working with there was that that as a theologian, if I don't have God as kind of the object, what is that? What is the focus of that theology in terms of deep mystery to explore, to elaborate symbols, and try to explain reality? And what I'm arguing in there is that it's Hegel's idea about dialectics, and it's important there that to remember, it's not just for Hegel as logic. It's not just a tool in logic. It's not just a pattern in history. It's also a pattern in the natural world. So that would properly be called metaphysics. He's saying this is what ultimate reality is. It is this pattern. For him, the pattern is following ideas, pulling it along. For the Marxist view, it's the history, and I would add the history of humans rejecting oppression or unequal treatment, pushing it along. But it's complicated, and so the complexity then becomes something for the theology to focus on and draw insights out of. So it's important in that way that theologians have always understood God to be a complicated thing to talk about. gives them stuff, gives them grist for the mill if the subject matter is complicated, is sort of the idea. I'm not as convinced that that's necessary anymore, but I was at the time. I wrote it, so we'll try and do that. But this will involve me trying to explain to you the deep metaphysics of dialectics, which is actually threefold. So the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that's only one part. There are two other parts of Hegel's dialectic, and so we'll have to talk about that to give you a full picture of what he's up to there, and I'll try to explain the thinking that I had at the time about why all of that is useful in a project for understanding humans and acting to make humans better.
So maybe there's another word that needs to be said, I don't know, besides theology or theologians, because the Greek is in my head, I hear God in those words.
You'll yeah. So if you have a chance to read it, you'll see I do toy with a word, and the word is a theology with.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, you did.
And theology, which is borrowing from oh nuts, who was it who did that? It was a Hegel scholar.
That's right.
Anyway,
yeah.
It's in there. He started that line, and I'm sort of picking that up as, okay, we do need a new word here, right? I had, because it's the same insight. I need a new vocabulary. Anyway, well, we'll see what again, I'm not so convinced today as I was then. We'll see what you all think next week, if that really is helpful or not, if it's necessary or not necessary, helpful or not. All right.
Thank you so much.
Complicated studying theology, isn't it?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, you all have a good week. I'll see you next week.
Okay, bye.